This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm Stephanie Disler, here to kick things off for this week's episode. Today, Mike is solo to talk about whether it's ever okay to let schools opt out of the state standardized test and use nationally normed assessments instead. Then, on a special Research Minute, David Griffith and Adam Tyner share their own findings from Fordham's latest report, Equitable Grading Through the Eyes of Teachers. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show, starting now.
Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. I am flying solo again for this week's episode. That's right, it is our monthly solo podcast. I've heard from several of you that you like it. I've heard from nobody yet that you hate it. So I'm going to keep doing it until I hear otherwise. It has now been about a week since the Petrilli family has been back from vacation. As I said last week, we were out west, out in the Rocky Mountains, having an amazing time doing a road trip from Denver to Albuquerque. If you haven't seen that part of the country, I highly recommend it, though I will warn you that your children may make you hike a 14er or mountain bike down a mountain. These are things that were really fun when I was in my 20s. Was a little scarier now that I'm in my 50s. But hey, I'm still alive. We're still here. All is well. And we are about a week out from school starting here in Montgomery County, Maryland. So, as I imagine a lot of parents are feeling right now, everything is accelerating. Summer is definitely coming to a close. Back to school season is here. That means back to school nights and games and practices and a lot of hectic activity. And I should say that the education reform world has not taken a break either. There is some news happening there too. Let's talk about it on Ed Reform Update. All right, so what I want to talk about this week is something that's been on my mind lately and something I'm really trying to work through. I like using these solo podcasts to try to wrestle with some things. And you can follow along with me as I do that. Of course, I always love to hear from you. Tell me what you think. The question I'm focused on right now is, when does it make sense to require schools to take the statewide criterion reference test? And when would it be okay to let them choose an off-the-shelf nationally normed test instead? What is making this a live issue is the news from last week, the announcement that Oklahoma State Superintendent Ryan Walters has declared that he is going to get rid of the statewide assessment in Oklahoma and let school districts choose their own nationally normed tests instead. Now, this, by the way, is highly against the law. Both the federal law and state law requires those statewide assessments in grades 3 through 8, once in high school. So he is asking for a waiver from the federal government to let him do this. At the same time, there is an ongoing debate within the school choice world about whether the private schools that participate in voucher or education tax credit or education savings account programs, if those schools should have to test participating students. And if so, should they have to use the state test, or can we let them choose among a menu of nationally normed assessments? Now, as one of the nation's biggest fans of state standardized testing, I'm tempted to give a very clear and consistent answer, right? If any school takes public money, it should have to take the public test. So, of course, Oklahoma, this is super wrong-headed. Of course, those schools in Oklahoma should take the state standardized test, but so should the private schools participating in school choice programs. They're taking the state money, take the state test. Easy peasy. But I have to admit that I am conflicted. I'll get to the conflict in a moment when it comes to the private schools. But first, let's talk about the public schools. Look, the reason that we have these state standardized tests is that we learned from a previous era of education reform that there were real problems with the nationally normed tests, especially if you attach real stakes to them. The state standardized tests, on the other hand, they are designed to be aligned to state standards, and they have to go through a rigorous peer review process, a process that I'm sure is not perfect, is bureaucratic, but is designed to make sure that there is alignment to those state standards, that the tests are high quality, that they're valid, that they're reliable. And thanks to the Common Core and the resulting assessments that came out of that, the PARCC, the Smarter Balanced, and now other assessments around the country, we are in a better place today when it comes to state standardized testing than we used to be. Back in the No Child Left Behind days, it was common to complain about low-level tests, fill-in-the-blank tests that could be easily gamed, tests that when you did kill and drill instruction, you could get test scores up. That was fair criticism. That was real. I would argue that we are now in a much better place with state standardized tests. Those tests are much better than they used to be. They are more like, say, advanced placement tests, where the only way you're going to do well on those tests is if you've actually mastered the material. There's more writing on them. The questions are pitched at a higher level. They are harder to game. Now, I'm not saying they're perfect, and frankly, it's hard to know now that there are different state standardized tests out there. Again, not just the PARCC and Smarter Balanced, which came out of the Common Core. So, hey, there could be some bad tests out there, I suppose. But my sense is they got a lot better. And we did a study a decade ago looking at PARCC and Smarter Balanced, and they were really good state-of-the-art tests at that time, much higher quality, right? It is also the case that the state standards and the assessments have now been connected to high-quality instructional materials. Curriculum materials that have been aligned to those standards and aligned to those tests. And so you have things like Eureka Math, Core Knowledge Language Arts, Wit and Wisdom, EL education, lots of good materials increasingly coming out of the nonprofit sector, which have increasing market share and which are better aligned to the state standards and better aligned to the science of reading, to the science of math, to what we know about what works. All of that connected together, okay? And so not only is the Oklahoma move wrong-headed, a bad idea, illegal, right? It would also bring us back to this time when districts could choose off-the-shelf tests, because that is what we had before the standards-based reform era. In fact, as I wrote this week for the Education Gadfly and for Flypaper at Fordham's website, this reminds us of the famous Lake Wobegon report. This was a report in the late 1980s by an amateur psychometrician who noticed that in school districts all over the country, those school districts were reporting that based on nationally normed tests, their kids were above average. This is like the fictional Lake Wobegon, where all the men are strong and all the women are beautiful, was it? And or maybe it was vice versa, and all the children are above average. Well, what was going on? It turned out that these nationally normed tests and the companies that ran them, in order to sell those tests to superintendents, those were their clients, they sold them tests that made their districts look good. Because they were not super careful about updating norms. Those national norms were set in a way that it was easy to exceed them. And so this study, which was later verified by professional psychometricians, showed that something like 70 to 90% of districts were reporting that they were above average nationally. That was great for the superintendents. That was surely great for other stakeholders, the teachers' unions. Not so good if you were a parent or a taxpayer. Not so good if you're a parent, you didn't know that your kid was not at the national average, but was actually below average, below grade level. Not great if you didn't know that your school was struggling, and instead it was shown to be doing great. So this is what in part motivated the standards-based reform movement and this push for state standards that would say, hey, let's spell out what we want kids to know and be able to do. Let's do it by grade band, eventually by grade level, and then have assessments that tell us whether they have mastered those standards, right? In the No Child Left Behind days, Those tests, as I mentioned before, were set at a low level. They were not great tests. They were also set at a low level, right? So you had something like 60, 70, 80% of kids in each state passing those tests, meeting the proficiency standard. After Common Core, we ratcheted up those tests dramatically, including what it took to be proficient, because now the idea was, no, what we want to report is not just whether kids are on grade level, we want to report whether they're on track for college or career. That is a smaller number of kids that are on track in that way, and that's what the tests are telling us. Whew, okay. So Ryan Walters, when he says he wants to ditch the end of the year state assessment, let districts choose their own test, it means going back to the Lake Wobegon days. It also means giving up on state standards. If you're not going to have an assessment to measure those standards, then you're basically giving up on state standards, and you're basically giving up on the state's constitutional duty to make sure that all kids in the state get a solid, uniform, high-quality education. All right, so we're against that. I'm against that. I hope that most of you are against that. So should we apply that same line of thinking to the private schools participating in these voucher or tax credit scholarship programs, right? And the strongest argument, I think, is in saying that, yes, they should have to take the state test because they're getting the state money, is transparency. We could know how those schools are performing, and we could make apples to apples comparisons between the private schools and traditional public schools and charter schools as well, right? That would be good for accountability purposes. It would be really helpful for parents who now have this increasing number of choices, and it would be helpful for them to know, how these schools are doing, especially on teaching reading and math, okay? However, I have been convinced over the years by the private school world that a state testing mandate would be a major problem for them. And that is because they understand that if they were taking the state test and being judged based on it, right, being evaluated based on that state test, they would feel a lot of pressure to align their curriculum and instruction with the state standards, right? Again, we just talked about that. That's the whole point of state tests, is to encourage teaching to the standards. And in effect, that would deprivatize these private schools, right? It would be a huge step in turning them into public schools. And that is not the point of private school choice, right? In fact, that's the great fear of a lot of libertarians and other people who have been following this issue, is that taking the state money, instead of opening up new options, is going to actually lead to greater to greater uniformity within the education system. And that is not, at the end of the day, what we're all about. So take, for example, the interest in classical education these days. A lot of classical private schools out there growing like gangbusters, and they are saying, hey, we have a very clear vision of what we think kids should know and be able to do, and it does not necessarily line up with state standards, right? We might have different grade levels where we think we need to teach certain things. We're definitely going to go way more in depth on the Greeks and the Romans and the classical stuff, and maybe we're going to give less attention over here to these other pieces that are in the state standards. If we believe in an education system where we want lots of choices and where we want to let parents opt out of the traditional public school system because it might not be a good fit for them or their kids, it's important to have those kinds of options remain different from one another. We don't want them to all be the same. And so, that to me is pretty compelling, right? It's pretty compelling. But again, life is full of trade-offs, right? One of the big things that those of us on the center right believe, I think probably most people understand this, life is full of trade-offs. It is hard to get everything you want in a policy. So on the one hand, state tests would be good for transparency. On the other hand, they could be bad in terms of forcing schools to be all the same. So is there a way we can balance that? Long ago, those of us at Fordham came out with a proposal on this very issue where we talked about a sliding scale. We said, if you're only taking a handful of kids in a voucher program, let's say, that means you're only taking a little bit of state money. Overwhelmingly, most of your school is being paid for by tuition and people that are paying their own way. It doesn't make sense to force you to take the state tests necessarily. It's fine. Test the kids that are participating with the nationally normed test. On the other hand, if you are a school, and there are a couple of these schools in places like Milwaukee or Cleveland, where you have, in effect, become a school where all the kids, in this case, low income, working class kids, all the kids are there using a public voucher or public tax credit scholarship. Your entire budget is funded by the state. I think at that point we would say it makes sense to take the state test, right? That make it based on how many kids are getting the voucher, how much of your budget is coming from the state. That's where we came with this trade-off. Okay, there's no way to square the circle exactly, right? Either you believe in giving private schools full autonomy from the state test or you don't. But maybe you say, okay, well, if you've already taken all this money, you've already decided to become closer to a public school, we're going to treat you more like a public school or like a charter school where you have to take the state test. I thought that was a pretty elegant solution. And so, there it was for many years. Now, fast forward to today, and we have a trick, which is this. All of a sudden, all these states are passing universal programs. It's no longer just poor and working class kids that are getting these vouchers or scholarships. And you all of a sudden have all these schools that have all of their students getting some kind of public subsidy. Again, because it's universal. Every private school in the state that's gone universal tells their parents, hey, we expect you to sign up to get this public money and then give that public money to us, right? And so, whereas there maybe were a handful of schools before where a lot of kids and most of the money was coming from the state, you suddenly have a ton of private schools that are in that situation. Basically, all the private schools, except for the super fancy, expensive independent schools where the vouchers don't come close to paying for the tuition. But most of the Catholic schools and the Christian schools and the other neighborhood schools down the street that are private, a lot of those suddenly are getting all of their kids and most of their money participating in these voucher programs. So under my sliding scale idea, suddenly those schools would have to take the state test. And again, they don't like that idea. Now, look, for the time being, we are probably at a stalemate. To their credit, the Trump administration has indicated that Ryan Walters' proposal to ditch the state test is not going anywhere. I think their quote was something like, this is far from a done deal. He has to go through all kinds of processes to formally request this. And everything we see indicates that they're not going to take kindly to that suggestion. That would be great, in my opinion. On the other hand, what we see with the school choice programs is that most red states have now adopted some kind of universal voucher or education savings account program. Almost all of those states, I think basically all of them but Arizona, have required participating kids to take some kind of test, but none of them require it to be the state test. They instead have opted for a menu of nationally normed tests. That is where we are right now. And the question that I would have is whether that status quo is sustainable, and that is TBD. All right, folks, that's all from me. Now it's time for everyone's favorite, Adam's Research Minute. Adam and David, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back.
Always a pleasure, Mike.
All right. So, guys, I'm excited. We are going to do a special edition of the Research Minute. This is a special self-promotional Research Minute because it is about a report that the two of you wrote and has now come out from the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Very exciting. Let me make sure I get the title right here. It is Equitable Grading Through the Eyes of Teachers. As people might expect, that means it is a survey of teachers. Let's start with this, guys. There's been a lot of talk. We've certainly covered this issue, but maybe not everybody's been following along about grading reform in recent years. Can you tell us just a little bit about those reforms and give us the sort of the steelman argument in favor of them?
Yeah, well, the idea that we should make grading better has been around forever. People have been complaining about the way that we grade and saying it's arbitrary or saying it's inconsistent. Literally, you can find stuff 100 years ago, people complaining about the ways that grades worked in schools. And so in the last few decades, there have been a number of people who have suggested different reforms to grades. And in the last few years, we've seen some of those reforms fall under the banner of equitable grading reforms. And to be honest, a lot of that is kind of marketing. This stuff has been around. Most of it has been around for longer than just the last few years. But we've been hearing about it around the country. And the idea is to make grading fair to everybody. And really, that underlying premise, I think, is hard to argue with. But the problem with some of these reforms is that many of them actually result in lowering grading standards and lowering academic expectations for students. So the reformers will suggest some things like they'll say that there's schools where you have to bring a box of Kleenex to class and get extra credit, and that we got to take that stuff out of grades because that's not equitable for students because some students can't afford to buy school supplies. That's very reasonable, and I don't know many people who disagree with that. But they'll also suggest that we should never assign zeros to students' grades if they don't turn things in, because that is just setting them up for failure in the rest of the class, or that we shouldn't impose deadlines on them, or that we should let them update if they turn in something and they get a bad grade, we should always let them retake that assignment. And sometimes the argument is that we should always let them retake it, even after they've, resubmitted it multiple times, or even after the course has ended or something. So some of this stuff is clearly lowering standards and expectations, encouraging procrastination. So although it's definitely a valid thing to try to make grading fairer, and we do have some tools for doing that, some of these more controversial policies are doing some stuff that really concerns us. And so that's why we wanted to ask teachers what they thought.
Okay, good. No, that's well said. And you're right that, the notion that grading is broken, that's not something that we would necessarily dispute. I mean, it's like in a lot of schools, teachers come in, they're hired, and they're not really told how to grade. Or maybe they're like, well, an A is from 90 to 100, but okay, how many points should the test be? And, how should I think about retakes? There needs to be at least some sense of, hey, do we have some standard ways of doing these things across classrooms, ideally across schools, within a district, maybe across the state? And some of this, again, I'm sympathetic. Some of the language is around standards-based grading. It's the notion that says, hey, we really want to understand if students are learning. And so by, for example, allowing retakes, you say, well, hey, if they retake a test or redo an assignment, and that results in them learning more and actually mastering the material, if we believe in mastery, a competency base, that's a good thing, right? They also say, look, it's basic math. If you give a kid a 0, that's so far below 60%, which would be like a normal D-, is that it drags everything else down mathematically. And right, some kids, if it's a big assignment, they're like, okay, no matter what I do the rest of this quarter, I can't get this grade up. I'm just going to give up. And so that's where some of that comes from, right? But like you said, the flip side is, oh my God, kids figure this out and they're like, oh, I can blow off the test. I can blow off the assignment. I'll get a 50%, or, hey, I've got a high A. I can totally blow off the next few assignments or skip school entirely, and I'm going to end up with an A. And so, it's shocking. Maybe some people are, utopian about the human condition, but there are some teenagers out there who will take advantage of these practices.
Well, I'm sympathetic to the idea that your grade should reflect what you learned in the class, but I think that most teachers, when they set their grading policy, they're trying to motivate students to do something before the end of the term. And I think that that's what gets lost a lot of the time when we talk about the mastery base and standards base, which I'm sympathetic to, and I think it probably can be executed well given the right training and the right conditions and everything. Some teachers are supportive of it, and I tend to trust them on that. But you got to be really careful if you're taking away all the short-term consequences, because part of the point of school is trying to help connect a long-term reward to something more short-term. And if we get rid of all of that and just say, well, whatever at the end, then it makes grades just kind of duplicative of sort of like an end of course exam or something. And most people, I think grades should encompass more than only your knowledge on the last day of class.
All right. So we asked teachers about some of these policies, things like the no zeros policy, or also known as the 50% rule, about whether they should be allowed to give credit for homework, credit for participation. David, what did we find out? Both about the how prevalent these reforms are and also about what teachers think of them.
Yeah. Right. I think those are the two big questions. So our first finding, just to get to it, is that about half of schools in the country, okay, half of teachers in the survey, but we think about half of schools in the country have adopted one of the five equitable grading policies that we asked about. It seems to be most common in middle school. It is particularly common in majority minority settings. And none of that's particularly surprising, but I think people might be surprised by just the percentage, right? I think this is perhaps an underrated issue. Just it's been flying under the radar. We haven't really had any data, but I can tell you that some version of this was in effect at a school I taught at, almost a decade ago. So that's our first finding. Our second finding is basically that teachers are skeptical of this stuff. And I want to be fair here because there is a pretty healthy range depending on the practice. So the single practice that got the most criticism from teachers is the no zeros policy, which is this notion that basically you can't give a kid lower than a 50% for any assignment or for any test. That teachers were essentially against that by a factor of like 10 to 1. Other policies did a little better, but teachers were still generally skeptical of homework bans. They were quite skeptical of bans on incorporating participation into student grades. There was some support for letting kids retake tests. But even there was there was a real split. And then our final finding, which sort of emerged as much from the comments that teachers made in the open response section as anything else, is basically that teachers are feeling pressured to inflate grades. That's not shocking. But some of the comments are shocking, right? Some of the anecdotes are pretty shocking. And so, we basically would try to flesh that out in the report and say, basically elevate teachers' voices around this and try to help people understand what it's like to be a teacher with a student who probably doesn't deserve a passing grade, and an administrator, a parent, some combination of those that basically is saying, you must pass this child.
So well said. And look, these people are heroes, right? A teacher who is willing to maintain a high standard for passing the course, for getting an A. I mean, there is nothing in it for these teachers, right? I mean, all of the incentives are, your life is easier if you just give away, easy A's. And I find it interesting and really impressive that the teachers, the one practice that are more willing to do is the retakes. That is something that often adds a ton of work for them, right? They might have to come up with a new form of the test, or they certainly are going to have to grade it some more. I mean, that's impressive because a lot of these other ones, that's not necessarily the case. So, kudos to teachers.
Well,
Yeah,
I think you're right. There's like something structural that's broken in the way that we hold students accountable. Putting this all on a teacher, that they've got to be both the coach and the referee, is just really makes it difficult to uphold standards, especially when even administrators, their bosses want them to pass more students. And that's really not the way it ought to be. I think we have to have more external measures of student learning so that we can put some of those incentives into the system. I mean, I think that's really the broader problem here, is that grading is too dependent on just kind of, the whims of a teacher or a department, or changing a policy like this, as opposed to being grounded in, more objective stuff like external measures of the students' learning.
Well, and as you've pointed out in other places, Adam, it's not like we have to develop a bunch of end of course exams necessarily. I mean, you could just have some of the assignments given by a particular teacher be graded by a different teacher. In a big district, it could be a teacher at a different school, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
I don't know. My experience now with two high schoolers is that they're putting, all of their assignments, all of their tests, everything's digital, and so it just seems like it wouldn't be hard. I'm sure there's platforms out there that can allow, you to send, the Whitman essays over here and the Blair essays over there, or maybe have a couple of teachers read each one, at least maybe for the bigger assignments or the bigger tests. I mean, something like that is doable, and, maybe not that much more work, but it would, as you say, get the teacher out of this experience of being both the coach and the referee, and the arbiter, which might help. The other thing I'd say is I'm sure for a lot of these teachers, like they want tools, right? They want to be able to motivate kids. And so, sure, if you have a kid that bombs a big assignment at the beginning of the quarter, and you do worry that giving them a 0 is going to demoralize them, then sure, we should give teachers the flexibility to give them a 50% instead, if the teacher wants to. That's very different from telling the teacher, you must give that kid a 0, right? Even if they didn't show any effort at all, or they're not even showing up for class, or they're not doing anything. I mean, I think that's, and I'm always curious too about how this intersects with the chronic absenteeism thing, right? I mean, if it's easy to get A's, whether you do the work or not, whether you show up or not, then that's yet another reason for kids not to show up.
Yeah, I'll just say I am a really big advocate for teacher autonomy when it comes to this sort of thing. It's just it's just a practical, pragmatic position that I have. We have 12 grades. We have I don't know how many subjects, right? We have kids at completely different levels with speaking different languages, coming in with different prior knowledge. The idea, every classroom is different and every student is different. And I really agree with the point about external exams, right? Or external measures. Sorry, we're going with measures, not exams, but they are probably, some of them are probably exams. But I think the thing that I would just want to say from personal experience, right, is that like it is such a, there is so much discretion involved in a teacher's job. And so many teachers, in my opinion, are already basically bleeding hearts who are bending over backwards trying to help the kids pass the course. The idea that we need to somehow come up with some big, I don't know, these universal rules really frustrate me, right? Because that's just it's doing violence to the reality of the classroom and the reality of the job, and it's not backed in any research that I'm aware of. It's just this reflexive impulse to kind of tie the teachers' hands behind their backs. Say something about homework that somehow applies to every grade level or every classroom in a district. And I don't really fully understand the motivation for it.
All right, guys, we will leave it there. Again, people should dig in. And you did mention the open response section, which really is enlightening, in many ways upsetting. So check it out. Equitable Grading Through the Eyes of Teachers by our very own David Griffith and Adam Tyner. We'll put it in the show notes. David, Adam, thank you for joining us. And if you still haven't gotten enough of this discussion, you should join us, Fordham, with our friends at TNTP on September 10th, 12 to 1 Eastern. We are going to have a live online event moderated by Jessica Gross, columnist at the New York Times, to talk about this discussion of how lowered grading standards is impacting students. And so that will be a great discussion as well. All right, that is all the time we've got for this week. So until next week,
I'm David Griffith.
And I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.